I misplaced the garbage can once, and the next day there was a police car at my door. Yes, she called the police because a bag of garbage was in the wrong place. Only things turned against her in an unexpected way. If there was one thing I didn't expect when I moved to an organized neighborhood, it was that the war would start over a garbage bag. That's right, a garbage bag. It wasn't a robbery, it wasn't vandalism, it was trash. The neighborhood had an HOA, that famous association that was supposed to exist to keep things running smoothly, but which in practice only served to empower people who had nothing else to do with their lives. And at the top of this empire of useless regulations was her, Barbara Winters, the president of the HOA, the supreme guardian of the order of the dump. It all started on a quiet morning. I, Alex Martinez, put out my trash like any civilized human being. But apparently I committed a heinous crime without realizing it, because instead of putting it in the black garbage can, I put it in the blue one. 5 minutes later, I heard firm footsteps on the sidewalk. When I looked out of the window, there was Barbara, her arms crossed, her face unfriendly, staring at my trash as if it were a time bomb about to explode and destroy world peace. I thought, oh, she must just be weirded out. But no, she was analyzing the crime scene. Suddenly, the lid of the blue garbage can was lifted, the garbage bag was nudged, and then, as if she were facing the biggest scandal in the neighborhood, she took pictures. Yes, photos of my garbage. I stood still, trying to understand what was going on. Perhaps it was a temporary outbreak, some kind of waste fetish? But no, the worst was yet to come. The next day, when I checked my mail, there was a fine from the HOA. The reason, improper waste disposal. And the amount? $75. $75 for one bag of garbage? I thought it was a joke, a prank perhaps, a social test to see how far people will accept abuse without question. But no, Barbara was 100% serious about it. And of course, since I'm a rational person, I did what anyone would do in this situation. I threw the fine in the bin, in the right garbage can this time, just in case. But the problem was that Barbara wasn't going to let it go, because in her mind it wasn't just a mistake, it was a personal affront. And people like her don't forgive affronts. Just as I was contemplating my next move, I heard a knock at my side door. It was Mike Reynolds, the retired Marine who lived across the street. Mike was in his 60s, with a military straight posture and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned him respect throughout the neighborhood, and a wide berth from Barbara. "Got a visit from the trash police yet?" he asked, a knowing smirk on his weathered face. I showed him the fine and he let out a low whistle. Barbara's really outdone herself this time. $75 for using the wrong bin? Last month she tried to fine me for flying my Marine Corps flag too high. Told her she could take it up with the federal government if she had a problem with it. Mike leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, between you and me, Barbara's been pulling this stuff for years. Most people just pay to avoid the hassle. But some of us think it's time someone stood up to her." His words gave me a confidence boost. I wasn't alone in this absurd battle. If I thought the fine was going to be the high point of the insanity, I was very wrong. Barbara hadn't finished with me yet. The next day, while I was trying to get on with my life as normal, I heard a dry knock on the door, the kind that tells you that the person on the other side didn't come in peace. When I opened it, there stood Barbara, holding a copy of the fine as if it were an arrest warrant, and with the expression of someone who was about to give a speech at the Hague Tribunal on War Crimes. She took a deep breath, straightened up like a CEO about to sack someone, and fired. "Did you get your notice?" "Oh yes, I did. I've even made good use of it. I just didn't tell her that I threw it in the trash where it belonged, but as I'm a polite person, or at least I try to be, I just let out a dry laugh." She expected me to complete the sentence with something like, "I've already paid," or "I'm sorry for committing this atrocity against humanity," but all she found was my bored look. Her expression contorted in indignation. "So why hasn't the payment been made yet?" And that's when it hit me. She was following me, monitoring my payment as if it were an overdue bank bill. I took a deep breath and let out the most sincere of questions. "You're charging me for a bag of garbage? Really?" Her eyes went wide, as if I had committed sacrilege, just by doubting the seriousness of that absurdity. I wasn't going to spend $75 to support the ego of a woman who clearly had no real problems in life. So I did what anyone would do. I'm not paying. Her face turned red, her eyes flashed with anger. It felt like I had slapped the HOA bylaws on the head and spit on the sacred rules of the neighborhood. She took a deep breath, gave me a, "You don't know who you're dealing with, look," and stomped away. But I did. I knew exactly who I was dealing with, and that's why I knew she wasn't going to let it go. Later that evening, Mike came by again, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, spreading several papers across my kitchen table. Barbara's HOA violation reports from the past year. The documents showed a disturbing pattern. Most fines were issued to newer residents, people who hadn't lived in the neighborhood long enough to know Barbara's tactics. And curiously, the heaviest fines went to homeowners who had refused to vote for her pet projects at previous HOA meetings. "This isn't about garbage, Alex," Mike said gravely. "This is about control. You're new here, so she's testing you, seeing if you'll fall in line." So what do I do? I asked. Mike smiled. Well, first, we document everything. And second, we wait. Barbara always overplays her hand. Always. He didn't have to wait long. If I was already sure that this woman wasn't a good match, she made a point of giving me concrete proof. 2 days after her visit, I was quietly watching TV when I heard a siren. At first, I thought it was the television, but when I looked out of the window, there was a police car parked in front of my house. The first thing I thought was, okay, something serious must have happened in the neighborhood. But when I saw Barbara standing there on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and the look of someone who has just witnessed a heinous crime, I knew it was about the garbage. She called the police about a bag of garbage. I didn't know whether to laugh or start digging a hole to hide from the shame, but as I'm curious, I opened the door to see how far this clowning would go. A policeman got out of his car with a look of boredom and regret at having chosen this profession. He was holding a notebook and talking to Barbara, who was gesturing as if she were narrating an action movie. I approached and heard the absurd phrase that came out of her mouth. He refuses to follow the neighborhood guidelines and is now in direct defiance of the HOA's authority. The officer turned to me, and from the look on his face, I knew that he too wanted to be anywhere else in the world but there. Sir, we received a report of a violation of neighborhood rules. I had to stop myself from laughing, but the best thing was the next detail. He didn't seem to know exactly why he was there. All he knew was that he had been called to a serious non-compliance situation. So I asked, "What's the charge?" Barbara gave me a deadly look, as if I had dared to question the sacred laws of the neighborhood association, but the policeman just sighed and looked down at his notebook. From the look on the policeman's face, he was already deeply regretting having shown up there, but his sense of professionalism kept him going. "Are you aware of the HOA rules?" I couldn't believe I was having this conversation with the police over a garbage bag. I let out a long sigh and kept myself from exploding with sarcasm. Look, if I'd known it was a federal crime to throw garbage in the blue garbage can, I would have hired a lawyer before I moved here. The policeman closed his eyes for a second, probably trying not to laugh. Then he turned to Barbara. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. The police cannot intervene in HOA administrative matters." Ah, the sweet taste of victory. She turned pale and opened her mouth to retort, but realized that even the police didn't want to hear anymore. So after muttering something about lack of respect for the rules, she turned her back and went into her house. What about me? I closed my door, went to the fridge and got a beer, because, honestly, I deserved a prize after that. But one thing was certain. She still hadn't accepted defeat. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike. Saw the police car. Barbara playing hardball already. Meet me at the corner pub in 30. We need to talk strategy. At the pub, I found not just Mike, but a small group of neighbors. Jennifer from 2 doors down, the Patels from the cul-de-sac, and old Mrs. Abernathy, who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. All of them had their own Barbara stories. "She fined me for having a bird feeder," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice trembling with indignation. "Said it was an unauthorized landscape feature. She tried to force me to take down my Diwali lights," Mr. Patel added. "Called them excessive holiday decorations, even though they were no different than Christmas lights." Each story was more ridiculous than the last, but what struck me most was the fact that these people, who'd lived with Barbara's tyranny for years, had never properly organized against her. "Why doesn't someone run against her in the next HOA election?" I asked. The table went quiet. Jennifer looked down at her drink. "People have tried, but Barbara always finds a way to disqualify the candidates or manipulate the vote. Plus, she's friends with half the board. Not to mention," Mike added grimly, "the last guy who seriously challenged her found his car key the next day. No proof it was her, of course. So what's the plan?" I asked. Mike leaned forward. "We need to catch her breaking her own rules. The HOA bylaws allow for emergency removal of board members who violate the very standards they're supposed to uphold. But we need evidence. Solid evidence." Little did we know, Barbara was about to hand it to us on a silver platter. After the embarrassment with the police, I swore this woman would settle down. Any normal person would have accepted defeat and moved on, but she wasn't normal. Over the next few days, I noticed that something was different in the neighborhood. First, an official email from the HOA was sent to all residents with the title, "The Importance of Following the Rules." And guess what example was used? "Recent cases of non-compliance with garbage guidelines have caused unnecessary inconvenience. The HOA will not tolerate behavior that violates community order." Oh right, now throwing the garbage in the wrong color was tantamount to a coup d'etat. I ignored it because, frankly, this fight had already given me enough headaches. But Barbara wasn't going to give up that easily. The following week, when I went to leave the house, I noticed something strange in my garbage can. It was empty. That's right, someone took all my garbage bags and simply made them disappear. The whole neighborhood was full, except mine. I took a deep breath, already feeling the anger rising. I took a quick walk around the block, and it wasn't long before I found my garbage dumped in the public trash can in the neighborhood park. Now I had 2 options. Ignore it and let this crazy woman live in her own delirium of power, or do something better. That's when I had the big idea. I went home, took out my cell phone, and recorded a video of my empty trash can. Then I went to the park and filmed my trash inside. The finishing touch? A very dramatic narration. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the most heinous crime in the history of this neighborhood, the mysterious disappearance of my trash. I posted the video on the HOA group, and that was that. The chaos began. Some neighbors laughed, others finally realized that Barbara was going too far. Some even commented, "This is way out of line. Who touches other people's garbage?" The Queen of Absolute Order didn't like the fuss at all, and of course, she wasn't going to leave it at that, because she always needed to have the last word. What I didn't expect was the neighborhood to split into factions. While many were fed up with Barbara, she had her defenders too. Mostly older residents who believed in strict rule enforcement and keeping property values high. They flooded the comments section with statements like, "Rules exist for a reason," and, "If you don't like it, move somewhere without an HOA." The tension was building, and I knew Barbara would retaliate. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. The next day, I came home to find a construction crew in my front yard, digging up my newly planted flower bed. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. The foreman looked confused. "HOA emergency maintenance. We've got approval to fix a water line issue." "What water line issue? This is my private property." He showed me a work order, signed by Barbara, authorizing emergency excavation to address water drainage problems affecting community property. I immediately called Mike, who came running over with his phone already recording. "This is harassment, plain and simple," he said, confronting the workers. "There's no water issue here." By this time, a small crowd had gathered. Barbara showed up shortly after, a smug smile on her face. "The HOA has every right to address infrastructure concerns," she announced loudly. Perhaps if some residents spent more time complying with community standards and less time making disruptive videos, we wouldn't need such drastic measures. The construction crew, realizing they'd been pulled into a neighborhood dispute, quickly packed up and left, leaving a torn-up mess of my yard. "You've gone too far," I told Barbara, barely containing my fury. "This is property damage." "Sue the HOA if you don't like it," she replied coolly. "I'm sure the board will be very interested in your history of non-compliance when reviewing your case." That night, an emergency meeting was called at Mike's house. The destroyed flower bed had crossed a line for many neighbors who had previously stayed neutral. "She's abusing her position," Jennifer said, "using HOA funds for a personal vendetta." "But how do we prove it?" Mrs. Abernathy asked. "Her name may be on the work order, but she'll claim it was a legitimate concern." That's when Mr. Patel spoke up. "I work in IT. If someone could get me access to the HOA email account, I might be able to find evidence of her plans." All eyes turned to Mrs. Abernathy. "I'm the board secretary," she said hesitantly. "I have the password to the shared account." And just like that, our resistance movement turned into something more serious. Were we crossing an ethical line? Possibly, but Barbara had pushed us to this point. If I thought her outburst had reached its limit, I was wrong, because the next day I received an official notification from the HOA. The reason? Defamatory posts against the association. That's right. Now, complaining that someone went through my garbage was a crime against the state of the neighborhood. But the problem for Barbara was that after my video, the HOA was divided. Some neighbors thought it was an exaggeration, but others began to question the absolute power this woman thought she had, and that's when things turned against her. 2 days later, Mr. Patel called an urgent meeting at his house. "You need to see this," he said, connecting his laptop to his TV screen. "What we saw stunned us all." Emails from Barbara to the construction company, specifically requesting them to dig up the Martinez property, with explicit instructions to make it messy. There were also emails discussing how to target other problem residents with selective enforcement of rules. But the most damning evidence came in the form of financial records. Barbara had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, a new patio, inspection trips to resorts, and even a $3,000 office decoration bill that appeared to be furniture for her home office. "She's stealing from us," Jennifer whispered in shock. "Not just stealing," Mike said grimly. "She's been running this place like her personal fiefdom." We now had a decision to make, one that would divide our viewers, just as it divided us in that room. Do we go public with potentially illegally obtained evidence? Do we confront Barbara privately first? Or do we hand everything to the authorities? The debate was heated. Mrs. Abernathy, despite her dislike for Barbara, was concerned about the legality of our actions. "We can't just hack into accounts and steal emails," she argued. "We didn't hack anything," Mr. Patel countered. "We used a legitimate login provided by a board member." Jennifer was worried about neighborhood unity. This could tear us apart for years. But Mike was firm. She crossed the line when she vandalized Alex's property. "This stops now." In the end, we We reached a compromise. We would call an emergency HOA meeting to address financial irregularities, without revealing how we obtained the information. If Barbara refused to step down, we would go public with everything. Someone, I don't know who, but a real angel, decided to investigate the HOA president's background even further, and guess what? She'd done it before. She fined a neighbor for leaving the car parked too long when it belonged to his son who was serving in the army. She tried to force an elderly woman to change her mailbox because it didn't fit in with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. She charged a neighborhood improvement fee without telling anyone where the money went. And after years of abuse, patience ran out. An emergency HOA meeting was called to discuss the president's conduct, and on the appointed day, the entire neighborhood showed up. The community center was packed, with neighbors standing along the walls. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Barbara arrived with her usual confidence, flanked by her few loyal supporters. She seemed shocked by the turnout, but maintained her composure. Mike had been chosen to present our case. With calm precision, he outlined the pattern of selective enforcement, the misuse of HOA funds, and the personal vendettas Barbara had pursued over the years. And most recently, he said, his voice resonating through the room, she authorized construction work to deliberately damage a resident's property as retaliation for questioning her authority. Gasps filled the room. Barbara shot to her feet. That's a lie. It was necessary maintenance. Is that so? Mike asked, nodding to Mr. Patel, who projected an email onto the wall. Barbara's explicit instructions to make it messy. The room erupted. Barbara's face drained of color as she realized she'd been caught, but she wasn't going down without a fight. How did you get that email? She demanded. That's private HOA correspondence. This is illegal. Her supporters rallied around this point, shouting about privacy violations and improper access. For a moment, it seemed like she might turn the tide. That's when Mrs. Abernathy, the quiet 78-year-old who had watched Barbara's reign for years, slowly rose to her feet. The room fell silent. As board secretary, she said, her voice thin but unwavering, I have full access to all HOA communications. And I am officially stating for the record that I provided these emails because I believe a crime has been committed against our community. Barbara tried to defend herself, threw in the old excuse that she was just doing her job, and that the rules are there for a reason, but no one wanted to hear any more. At the end of the meeting, a vote was taken to remove her from the chair. The result? A near unanimous vote. Only Barbara and her husband voted against it. She was officially expelled from the HOA. The aftermath was complicated. Some residents felt we had gone too far in our methods. Others believed we hadn't gone far enough and wanted to pursue criminal charges for the financial misappropriation. The neighborhood was healing, but the scars would remain for some time. And what about me? Oh, I made sure to enjoy the moment. The next day I threw my garbage in the blue garbage can again, just to get a taste of victory. And for the first time in a long time, I woke up knowing that the neighborhood was finally free of the dumpster dictatorship. Mike stopped by that evening with a six-pack. To freedom, he toasted, clinking his bottle against mine. To standing your ground, I replied. We sat on my porch, watching the sunset over a neighborhood forever changed by a single bag of garbage in the wrong bin. Was it worth all the drama? The destroyed flower bed? The neighborhood division? I'd like to think so. Sometimes it takes a small act of rebellion to expose a greater injustice. Have you ever had to deal with one of these in your life? The kind of person who thinks they run the world? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it for more unbelievable stories like this one.